The smoke hit her first, not the thin, forgiving kind that rises from a pot left too long on the stove, but the thick, black, deliberate kind that curls upward with intention, the kind that announces itself like a woman who has finally decided she is done being invisible. Della Gentry stood at the iron cookstove in the Boone Ranch kitchen and watched the cornbread blacken, and she did not move a single muscle to stop it. She heard them before she saw them. Two sets of boots on the wooden floorboards, the heavier pair belonging to Caleb, who was 14 and had the same square jaw as his father, and the lighter pair belonging to Thomas, who was 11 and still had the round-cheeked softness of a boy not yet grown into his grief. They had come running at the smell of smoke, the way children always do, drawn by the alarm of something burning in a place that had been cold and silent and careful for too long. And then something happened that stopped Della's heart mid-beat. They laughed. Not the polite, nervous kind of laugh she had heard from them in the 3 months since Nelson Boone had brought her to this ranch as his wife of necessity, his housekeeper in all but paperwork, his solution to a problem that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his loneliness and his guilt and the terrible, frozen silence his house had become since Margaret Boone had died 18 months before. Not that careful, watchful sound they made when they didn't want to offend anyone. This was the real thing, the helpless, gasping, bent double kind that only happens when something catches a person completely off guard, when their body reacts before their sorrow can clamp down on it. Caleb pointed at the blackened square of cornbread. Thomas had tears running down his face. The sound of them filled every corner of that kitchen and pressed up against the windows like something wild trying to get back inside from the cold. Nelson Boone appeared in the doorway a moment later. He had been in the barn, and he still had hay in his hair and a look on his face like a man who had been gut-shot and was only now realizing it. He looked at his sons, really looked at them, with the kind of terrified, hungry desperation of a father who had not been sure he would ever see his children laugh again. Then he looked at Della, standing at the stove with the ruined pan in her hand and smoke rising around her shoulders like a halo she had not been born with but had earned, and something crossed his face that was too large and too raw and too dangerous for either of them to name yet. But Della had burned that cornbread on purpose, and she had done it because she had been watching those boys for 3 months, and she had understood something about grief that Nelson Boone, in all his hardness and his sorrow, had not yet figured out. Sometimes you have to break something small and harmless to remind the people around you that the world is still willing to be a little ridiculous. Sometimes you have to let something burn. This is where it began, at the end of something unbearable, in the middle of a kitchen that smelled like char and possibility. But to understand why Della Gentry was standing in a kitchen in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1883, burning cornbread with the focused precision of a woman executing a plan, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the advertisement in the back of the Santa Fe Weekly Gazette, the one she had clipped with a pair of sewing scissors while sitting in the cramped boarding house room in Albuquerque that had been her world for 7 months after the man she thought she was going to marry had taken her savings and her trust and her future and ridden north without leaving so much as a note. His name was Raymond Pell, and she had been a fool about him, and she knew it, and she had long since stopped crying over it. She was 24 years old in the autumn of 1883, and she had been a schoolteacher in Albuquerque for 2 years before Raymond. Pell arrived at a church social and smiled at her with every one of his teeth. She had been sensible and careful, and she had saved money in a tin box under her floorboard for 3 years, and Raymond had borrowed it to invest in a copper mine that did not exist, and then Raymond had disappeared, and Della had been left with $4, a room, and a burning, iron-cold fury that had nowhere to go. The advertisement had been straightforward. Rancher, widowed, 2 sons, 800 acres outside of a town called Cassidy Creek, New Mexico Territory, needs a capable woman to manage the household and serve as wife. Must be willing to work hard. Compensation includes room, board, and fair wages in addition to legal standing. It was not romantic. It was not supposed to be. It was a transaction, clearly stated on both sides, and Della Gentry had answered it because she was practical and she was broke, and she was 24 years old in the West in 1883, where a woman alone had very few good options and a great many terrible ones. She had written her letter with the precision of a woman applying for a teaching position, listing her skills honestly, her experience managing a household, her comfort with cooking and sewing, and the thousand small competencies of frontier life. And she had sent it to a post office box in Cassidy Creek, and she had waited. Nelson Boone's reply had come in 11 days, which she later learned was record time for him, a man who wrote letters the way he spoke, which was in short, measured sentences with no wasted words. He had written that she seemed suitable and that he would pay for her stage passage, and that there was a room set aside for her, and that she should understand clearly that this would be a marriage of arrangement and not one of sentiment. He had underlined, not one of sentiment, in a way that made her wonder if he was warning her or himself. She had packed her one good trunk and her 2 less good bags, and she had taken the stage from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, and then the southern route to Cassidy Creek, which was a 3-day journey that involved a broken wheel, a creek crossing that soaked her boots completely through, and a conversation with a traveling minister who told her she was very brave, which she found both encouraging and faintly alarming. Nelson Boone had been waiting at the stage depot when she arrived. She had expected someone older. Not ancient, but worn in the way that widowed men who had been working land alone for a year and a half tend to be worn, stooped and gray and swallowed by their circumstances. Instead, she had found a man of 34 who was broad across the shoulders and stood very straight with the kind of posture that comes not from pride, but from years of physical work that had simply built him that way. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and brown eyes that were careful and guarded in the way that eyes get when they have been hurt so many times that the body installs its own protection without asking. He was handsome, which surprised her. She had not factored handsome into her calculations, and she found it mildly inconvenient. He had taken her trunk from the stage driver without being asked, which told her something. He had said, "Miss Gentry," in a voice that was low and measured, which told her more. He had not smiled, but he had looked at her directly, which in her experience was rarer than most people thought and more valuable than almost anything else. He had helped her into his wagon, and they had ridden the 9 miles to the Boone Ranch in almost complete silence. And the silence had not been unfriendly exactly, more like 2 strangers respecting the weight of what they were undertaking. And Della had looked at the flat red land stretching out in every direction under a sky so enormous it felt slightly threatening. And she had thought, well, here you are, Della Gentry, at the far edge of everything, and it had better work. The ranch was larger than she had imagined from the letter. The main house was solidly built from adobe and timber, 2 stories, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, and there were outbuildings in good repair. A barn and a smokehouse and a small bunkhouse where Nelson's hired hand, a weathered man of 50 named Arlo Sims who had been with the Boone operation for 12 years, kept his quarters. The land was red and dry and beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they do not care whether you find them so. The boys had been waiting on the porch when she arrived. Caleb had stood very straight in obvious and painful imitation of his father and had said, "Ma'am," in a voice that was doing its level best to be steady. Thomas had stayed behind his brother's shoulder and looked at Della with eyes that were the color of winter grass, large and serious and full of a watchfulness that did not belong in an 11-year-old face. Della had looked at them both and felt something shift in her chest, not pity exactly, but a recognition. She knew what it was to need something you could not ask for and could not name. She had not been a motherless child, but she had been a lonely one, and loneliness in children has a particular texture that she had learned to identify as a schoolteacher, and both of these boys were wearing it like a second skin. She had said, "I am very glad to meet you both. I have heard that you are good workers, which I appreciate, because I am going to need the help." Caleb had blinked. Thomas had come out a little from behind his brother's shoulder. Neither of them had smiled, but something had shifted in the set of their faces, some infinitesimal easing that told her she had said something right without fully knowing why. The first weeks were difficult in the way that things are difficult when everyone is trying very hard to behave correctly, and the effort of it is exhausting. The legal ceremony had been performed at the office of the Justice of the Peace in Cassidy Creek 3 days after Della's arrival, a 6-minute affair witnessed by Arlo Sims, and a woman named Harriet Moore, who ran the dry goods store and had known Nelson since before Margaret died, and who had looked at Della with an expression that contained equal parts hope and protective suspicion, which Della respected. The certificate was filed, the arrangements were established, and Della moved her trunk into the bedroom that had been prepared for her at the end of the upstairs hall, which was separated from Nelson's room by a locked door and a very clearly communicated mutual understanding. The marriage was, as stated, not one of sentiment. The house had a darkness in it that had nothing to do with the light. Margaret Boone had been dead for 18 months, but she was everywhere. Not in any morbid way, not in the way of haunting exactly, but in the way that a woman who has made a home leaves herself imprinted on every surface she ever touched. Her curtains were still in the windows. Her recipe box was still on the kitchen shelf, and it was clear that no one had opened it since she died, because the small iron latch had a layer of dust on it that had the undisturbed quality of something deliberately avoided. Her apron still hung on its hook by the back door, and in the first week Della had unconsciously reached for it twice before catching herself and choosing instead to use the plain canvas one she had brought in her trunk. She did not resent Margaret Boone. She could not. A woman who had raised 2 sons like Caleb and Thomas, and who had inspired in Nelson Boone the kind of grief that had frozen a whole house in amber, was clearly a woman worth remembering. But Della was practical, and she understood that living permanently in the shadow of someone else's story was not going to be good for any of them. Nelson Boone was, she quickly discovered, a man of iron habits and locked doors. He worked from before dawn until after dark. He ate the meals she prepared without complaint and sometimes without apparent notice. He was not unkind. He said please and thank you, and he did not raise his voice, which she appreciated. But he maintained a careful, scrupulous distance from her that went beyond mere formality. It was the distance of a man who was afraid of something, and she thought she understood what it was. He had loved someone completely, and that person had died, and the calculation he had made somewhere in the wreckage of that loss was that if he never let himself need anyone again, the arithmetic of loss would be manageable. She understood the logic. She found it tragic. The boys were quieter than any children she had ever taught. Not silent, not mute, but careful with their words in the way that children become careful when they have learned that showing feeling is followed by pain. Caleb in particular had armored himself with a grave, serious efficiency that made him seem much older than 14. Thomas was the softer one, and she could see the effort it cost him to maintain the emotional containment his father and brother modeled for him, could see the moments when something funny or surprising or bright would happen, and he would almost react before stopping himself, as if laughter were something he no longer had permission to do. She had been thinking about it for weeks, about what it would take, about what the right lever was, the right small, harmless catalyst that could crack something open without anyone feeling ambushed by it. She was a teacher. She knew children, and she knew that grief in a household is an atmospheric thing, a weather system that everyone breathes whether they mean to or not. She also knew that you could not lecture your way out of it, or sit someone down and explain to them that it was permissible to be happy again. You had to create the conditions. You had to make an accident, so she had burned the cornbread. Deliberately watching the smoke rise, listening for footsteps, calculating the moment with the precision of a woman who had spent 3 months paying very close attention to two boys who needed permission to be boys again. And it had worked. And Nelson Boone had seen it. That was the part she had not fully calculated. In the days after the cornbread, something changed in the house that was subtle but unmistakable, the way a season changes, not all at once but in a series of small permissions. Thomas began talking at dinner, tentatively at first, offering observations about things that had happened during the day that were sometimes funny in the accidental way that life at 11 is often funny. A horse that had been spooked by its own reflection in a water trough, the discovery of a jackrabbit living in the hay bales. Caleb still held himself more carefully, but Della caught him twice smiling when he thought no one was looking. Nelson watched all of this with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, a kind of stunned, grateful wariness, as though he couldn't quite trust that the thaw was real, and was holding himself back from believing in it so it couldn't be taken from him. He had not spoken directly about the cornbread incident. But the morning after it happened, she had come downstairs to find that the cast iron skillet she had ruined had been cleaned and re-seasoned and hung back in its place over the stove, and there was a fresh bag of cornmeal on the kitchen table. That was Nelson Boone's version of a conversation, and she was beginning to learn to hear it. It was a week after the cornbread incident that Nelson Boone said something that surprised her. They were on the porch after supper, which was not something either of them had done before. She had stepped out for air after washing the dishes, and he had come out a few minutes later and leaned against the porch post in the way that men who work outside all day have of arranging themselves against things. And for a while, they had both looked at the darkening sky over the red land without speaking. There was a particular quality to the silence between them, by now, that was different from the early days. It had lost its careful, managed tension and become something else, something closer to companionable, which she found more dangerous. He said, "You did that on purpose." She said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "Yes, you do." There was a pause. A coyote called somewhere out in the dark, and the stars were the dense, overwhelming kind that only happen when you are very far from town. She said they needed to laugh. They had forgotten how. He was quiet for a long time after that. She thought he might go inside, but then he said she used to burn things sometimes, not on purpose. She just talked too much while she cooked and forgot to pay attention, and the boys thought it was the funniest thing in the world. A pause. "I hadn't thought about that in a long time." Della said nothing. She had learned that Nelson Boone needed silence the way other people need prompting. He said, "I don't know what you want here, Della." She turned and looked at him, which took a small act of courage because the directness of her own gaze in moments of real conversation had always been something people found unexpected. She said, "I want exactly what was agreed to. I want to do my work well, and I want those boys to be children again, and I want this house to have some air in it." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "And nothing else," she said. "I didn't say that." She went inside before he could answer, because she was not yet ready for whatever came next, and neither was he. The town of Cassidy Creek was small enough that everyone knew everything, and what they knew about Nelson Boone's new wife was a subject of considerable interest. There were people who approved, primarily those who had watched the ranch and the boys suffer for a year and a half and who were relieved that someone was there. There were people who disapproved, primarily those who had known Margaret and who felt that any replacement was a form of betrayal, even if they wouldn't have been willing to define it that way. And then there was Agnes Whitmore. Agnes was 43, the wife of the man who owned the Cassidy Creek Bank, and she had been Margaret Boone's closest friend. And she had appointed herself the guardian of Margaret's memory with a fervor that had very little to do with love for the dead, and a great deal to do with her own unexamined feelings about Nelson Boone, which she had buried under the concrete of her disapproval so thoroughly that she probably could not have found them herself if she tried. Della encountered her for the first time at the dry goods store 3 weeks after her arrival, when Agnes had looked at her over the counter with the specific expression that certain women reserve for other women they have decided to find threatening, and had said very pleasantly, "We were all so fond of Margaret. It must be strange for you, coming into a house with so much history." Della had looked at her and said, just as pleasantly, "I imagine it's stranger for the boys." This had not endeared her to Agnes Whitmore. The second encounter had been at the church social in October, which was the first social gathering Della had attended in Cassidy Creek, and which was the occasion for her being introduced to approximately 40 people in the span of 90 minutes, most of whom were kind, and a few of whom were measuring her with the frankness that frontier communities use with newcomers, because the stakes of knowing who your neighbors really are have always been higher when your nearest help is 9 miles away. Agnes had found her by the punch bowl and had said, with the particular warmth of a woman who means none of it, "Nelson seems to be doing so much better. We were worried about him, you know." After everything, Della had said, "He is a resilient man." Agnes had said, "He was devoted to Margaret, completely devoted. She was extraordinary, you know. There was no one like her in this whole territory." Della had said, "I'm sure that's true." Agnes had said, "I just want to make sure that everyone understands what they're stepping into, for all parties' sake." Della had put down her cup of punch and looked Agnes Whitmore fully in the face and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know what it is you think I need to be warned about, and I am quite sure you believe you are acting out of love for someone you have lost, but I would ask you to consider that I am not a threat to anyone's memory, and I am not attempting to replace anyone, and that the people in that house need to be able to breathe, and that perhaps protecting a memory so fiercely that the living cannot move is its own kind of damage." Agnes had gone quite still. Della had walked away and spoken to Harriet Moore about the quality of the flour she had been stocking, and had felt the particular cold burn of having said something true that was going to cost her. She had been right. It cost her. The next 4 weeks brought a series of small, orchestrated social difficulties, invitations that were offered and then quietly rescinded, conversations that stopped when she entered them, the kind of cold shoulder that a town can turn on a person without anyone ever being willing to say they are doing it. It was petty and it was effective, and it made Della's jaw tight with a fury she did not allow herself to show. She had not told Nelson about it. She had not been sure how he would respond, and she had not wanted to ask him to defend her, because that was not the arrangement, and she was proud in the way that people become proud when they have been betrayed before and have learned not to ask for help until they have exhausted every other option. It was Harriet Moore who told him. Harriet was a practical woman of 51 who had been in Cassidy Creek for 20 years, and who had a zero-tolerance policy for what she called the particular cruelty of small-town women, which she defined as any cruelty conducted under the cover of concern. She had told Nelson Boone, apparently directly and without adornment, what Agnes Whitmore had been doing, and Nelson had driven into town the next day without telling Della where he was going. She had found out what happened from Arlo Sims, who had been with Nelson on the supply run and who had the same quality that old cowhands often have of reporting facts without editorializing, which meant that what Arlo described as Nelson having some words with Agnes Whitmore in front of the bank, and her husband standing there not knowing what to do with himself, was probably considerably more dramatic in person. What Nelson had said was this, according to Arlo: "Margaret was my wife and I loved her, and she is gone, and I am doing my best to raise her sons in the world she left them. Della is my wife now, and she is making that house livable again, and if you make her unwelcome in this town you are not honoring Margaret, you are using her, and I will not have it." Arlo reported that Mrs. Whitmore had said something indistinct. Nelson had apparently said, "I am asking you to be decent. I would prefer not to have to ask twice." And then he had gone to the feed merchant and purchased 200 pounds of oats and a new bit for the harness and driven home. When Della heard this from Arlo that evening while Nelson was still in the barn, she had stood in the kitchen for a long moment doing nothing, which was unusual for her. Then she had sat down at the kitchen table, which was also unusual, and she had sat there until she heard Nelson's boots on the porch step. When he came in, she said, "You didn't have to do that." He hung his hat on the peg by the door and said, "Yes, I did," she said. "It's my battle." He said, "It was happening in my town to my wife. I don't see how that's not also my battle." She looked at him. He looked at her. There were a great many things that could have been said in that moment, and neither of them said any of them, which was in its own way a kind of conversation. She said, "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," which she recognized by now as the Nelson Boone version of "you're welcome," and also "I feel things I don't know how to discuss," and she let it be. November came to the New Mexico territory with the particular cold clarity that the high desert produces. Mornings that were sharp as glass, and afternoons that still held warmth if you stood in the sun. The work of the ranch was relentless in the way that ranch work always is, the livestock requiring care, the fences requiring maintenance, the equipment requiring attention, and Della had long since expanded her role from strictly domestic to whatever was needed, because that was who she was and she could not help it. It was during this month that she and Nelson Boone began, without any formal acknowledgement that this was what was happening, to spend time together that was not strictly necessary. It started with the horses. Della was a capable rider. She had ridden since childhood, and horses were one of the things she trusted more readily than most people, because they did not have hidden motives and did not pretend. She had asked Nelson after her third week at the ranch if she could use one of the horses to ride when she wanted to, and he had shown her the bay mare named Cora without any fuss, and she had been riding when she could since then. One afternoon in early November, she had ridden out to the southern pasture fence, which she knew needed attention because Arlo had mentioned it at breakfast, and she had been trying to work out what to do about a section of wire that had come loose from its post when Nelson had appeared over the ridge on his gray horse. He had pulled up and looked at the fence and looked at her, and then dismounted and taken the fencing pliers from her without making a thing of it, and they had worked together on the fence for an hour and a half in the dry, golden afternoon light, and the silence between them during that time had been the best silence she had been in since she was a child. When the fence was done, they had ridden back toward the ranch in no particular hurry, and he had said, "How did you know about the south fence?" She said, "Arlo mentioned it was getting loose." He said, "You pay attention," she said, "it is one of the things I do." He said, "Margaret didn't like the ranch. She was good at it, she worked hard, but she didn't like it. She was a town person." Della looked at the land around her, the red bluffs and the dry grass and the enormous sky. She said, "I like it. I didn't expect to, but I do." He looked at the land too, and something in his face that had been held very carefully for a long time loosened, just slightly. She pretended not to see it. December arrived, and with it the particular tension of the first Christmas without her. That was how it was referred to by everyone, as though there were only one, as though all the Christmases to come would be numbered from that one absence. Caleb had become quieter in the week before, and Thomas had taken to sleeping with a small book of illustrated Bible stories that had been his mother's, holding it against his chest like a talisman. Della had been thinking about this for weeks, the way she thought about problems that mattered, from multiple angles, turning them over and examining them, looking for where she could be useful without being intrusive. She had decided that what was needed was not a substitution but an addition. Not pretending Margaret did not exist at Christmas, but not pretending she was the only story in the house either. She had asked Caleb, one afternoon when they were alone in the barn and he was helping her look for eggs in the hay, what his mother had loved about Christmas, and the question had surprised him so much that he had answered it before his defenses engaged. He said, "She made spice cake. And she sang really loud and off-key on purpose because it made us laugh." Della said, "Did you have decorations?" He said, "She made paper chains, red and green. She always burned them at New Year's and said it was the only good way to get rid of Christmas." He had stopped then, looking slightly startled at himself, as though he had said more than he meant to. Della had said, "Thank you for telling me. That is good to know." She had made the spice cake. She had found the recipe, finally, in Margaret's recipe box, which she had opened carefully, and with a kind of reverence, feeling the weight of the hidden motive of her own presence in this house, the complicated ethics of being someone's replacement when you had not asked to be, and they had not asked to be replaced. She had made the cake 2 days before Christmas, and the smell of it had done something to the air in the house that she hadn't been prepared for. Thomas had come into the kitchen and stood very still for a moment, and then he had come to her and leaned against her arm, which was the first time either boy had touched her voluntarily, and she had kept very still like a woman who has found a bird on her hand and does not want to frighten it away. She had put her arm around him carefully, and he had stayed there for a minute and then gone back outside, and she had stood in the kitchen for a moment with her eyes very bright, feeling the weight of what it means to be trusted by a child who has been hurt. Nelson had come into the kitchen an hour after that, ostensibly to get water, and he had smelled the cake and stopped in the doorway with an expression she could not fully read. She said, "Is this wrong? I cannot bring it to the table if you'd rather not." He said, "No," a pause. "No, it's right." He had poured his water and stood with it for a moment without drinking it. He said, "How did you know to do that?" She said, "Caleb told me." He said, "He doesn't talk," she said. "He talks to me." This surprised him visibly. He said, "Does Thomas?" she said. "Thomas talks constantly, you just have to be there at the right time." He looked at her for a long moment with the complicated expression that she had begun to recognize as the one he wore when he was feeling something he had not given himself permission to feel. Then he said, "I don't know how you know how to do this." She said, "I was a teacher. Children are the thing I know best." He said, "It's more than that." She did not answer that. She did not know how to answer it, and she suspected that if she answered it they would both be in territory that neither of them had agreed to enter, and she was still afraid of that territory even as she was beginning to be drawn toward it with a pull that had no respect for her careful calculations. Christmas was good. Not easy, not perfect, containing its full weight of loss, but good. They made the paper chains, and she and the boys hung them while Nelson watched from the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing it did when he was trying not to show that something mattered to him. At dinner they told stories about Margaret, because Della had asked the boys over the past weeks to tell her things about their mother, and they had come to dinner with them, small bright memories like gifts unwrapped, and the telling of them did not tear the room apart the way she had feared it might. Instead, it made Margaret present in the room in a way that was warm rather than aching, a voice remembered rather than a wound reopened. Della told a story about her own mother burning Christmas cookies in the same breath as telling the boys she was the best cook in the county, and Thomas had laughed his real laugh at the image of it, and Caleb had smiled, actually smiled, a full, open, uninhibited smile that rearranged his whole face and made him look exactly like his father, and Nelson had looked at Caleb's face and then looked at Della across the table and said nothing. But his eyes said everything she was not ready to hear yet. The dark past came for them in January. It came in the form of a man named Gentry, who was Della's older brother and who was not a good man. This was not a secret. Della knew it and had known it most of her life. Harlan was 4 years older than her and had spent most of those years moving around the territory, staying one step ahead of various consequences. And he had a particular relationship to money that was entirely predatory and entirely indifferent to the well-being of anyone who got between him and it. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning in January, riding a horse that did not belong to him, and he had the particular swagger of a man who has convinced himself that family connection is a currency he can spend indefinitely. He had heard about Della's marriage, presumably from someone in Albuquerque, and he had come with a story about debts and dire straits and the certainty that his sister, now married to a man of property, would be moved to help him. Della had seen him coming from the kitchen window and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach in the specific way it does when the past arrives uninvited at your present. She had gone out to meet him before he reached the house. She said, "Harlan." What are you doing here?" He had spread his arms in the way he had, the big, expansive gesture of a man performing warmth he did not feel, and said, "Is that any way to greet your brother?" "It is when it's you. How much?" He had dropped the performance and said $200, which was an enormous sum, and told her a story about a debt to a man in Las Cruces that involved threats she suspected were real because Harlan had a talent for acquiring dangerous enemies. He wanted her to ask Nelson for it. She said, "No." He said, "Della, this is blood." She said, "You don't get to use that word. You have used the word blood to take from me before, and I am done with it." This was a reference to the fact that Harlan had known about Raymond Pell and his copper mine fraud before it happened and had said nothing, had in fact pointed Raymond toward Della in the first place, which was the darkest, most secret betrayal she carried, the one she had not told anyone here, the one she was afraid would change how people saw her if they knew she had been that foolish. Harlan had shifted tactics, as Harlan always did. He had said he would cause trouble. He had said he would tell people in Cassidy Creek things about her past that would complicate her position here. He did not specify what because she suspected he was improvising, but the threat was real in the sense that any secret can become a weapon if you frame it correctly. She said, "Get off this property, Harlan." Nelson had appeared from the barn. He had seen the conversation and come without being asked, and he stood a few feet away with that still, contained quality he had, which was its own kind of threat because it was so clearly not going to perform itself. It was just going to wait there and be real. Harlan had looked at Nelson and made a quick calculation. He said, "You must be the husband. Your wife has some history that might interest you." Nelson had said, "I'm not interested in anything you have to say." Harlan had said, "She was involved with a man in Albuquerque who turned out to be a fraud. She gave him her savings, which is how she ended up looking for a husband arrangement in the papers. Some people might think a woman with that kind of judgment has a hidden motive for the choices she's made." There was a silence. Della felt the exposure of it like a physical thing, the secret she had been carrying uncovering itself in the cold January air. Nelson looked at her. She met his eyes and did not look away, because she was done being ashamed of things that had been done to her rather than by her. He said, "I know about Raymond Pell." Della blinked. She said, "What?" He said, "I had someone look into your background before you came. I know what happened. I know he was a fraud and I know what you lost, a beat." "I never cared." She stared at him. The January wind moved between them. Harlan, correctly reading the room, made another quick calculation and appeared to decide that whatever leverage he had imagined he possessed had just evaporated. Nelson said to Harlan, very quietly, "You are going to leave now, and you are not going to come back, and you are not going to threaten my wife again. That is not a request." Harlan looked at Nelson for a moment, then at Della, then back at Nelson, and the math was clear to everyone. He rode away, and Della watched him go with a complicated mixture of relief and the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a dark past and finally having it set down. She said, "You knew about Raymond," he said, "from the beginning." She said, "Why didn't you say so?" He said, "Because it was yours to tell if you wanted to. It wasn't my information to use." She stood with this for a moment. The wind had the cold, mineral smell of the high desert in winter. She said, "I was ashamed." He said, "Of what?" "Of being deceived by someone you trusted." She said, "Of being that naive." He said, "You trusted someone, he violated it. That's not your failure." She looked at him, this man who was so careful with his words that, when he spent them, they always landed with precision. And she felt something shift in her that she had been holding in careful suspension for months, a warmth she had been refusing to examine too closely because the terms of this arrangement had been clearly stated, and she was not going to be naive again. She was not going to let herself want something she hadn't been offered and risk the whole careful structure she had built. She said, "Nelson." He said, "Don't." She said, "Don't what?" He said, "Don't say whatever you're about to say. That makes this something we have to make a decision about." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I'm not sure I know what I'm doing yet." She said, "Fair enough." She went back inside and she made lunch, and when he came in he sat down at the table and they ate together in silence, but it was a different silence than any they had shared before. It was the silence of two people who have said the thing underneath the thing without saying it, and who have agreed, without agreeing, to hold it there while they figure out what to do with it. February arrived with a warm spell that felt like a secret, the land soft and gold for a week before the cold reasserted itself. And in that warm week something in the household shifted in a way that was irreversible. It was small, accumulated changes rather than any single dramatic moment. Nelson began coming in from the barn earlier in the evenings. He sat with the boys after supper sometimes, listening to Thomas's increasingly elaborate stories about things that had happened during the day. The stories were now frequently funny and self-aware, and Caleb had begun contributing to them with a dry humor that he had clearly inherited from his father. One evening Thomas had asked Della to read to them after supper, and she had read from David Copperfield, which she had in her trunk, and she had done the voices with shameless theatricality that made Thomas fall off his chair laughing, and made Caleb look away quickly to hide his smile, and made Nelson Boone, sitting in the chair by the window with his mending that he wasn't actually working on, look at her with an expression she had stopped pretending to herself she didn't recognize. It was, she thought, an expression she had been seeing for some time. She had been calling it gratitude because that was safe. She was increasingly failing to make that label stick. In early February, the first real crisis came. Thomas developed a fever that started on a Monday evening as what seemed like a common cold and became, by Wednesday morning, something that frightened her. She had experience with childhood illness from her years as a teacher, and she knew the difference between an illness that was running its course and one that was climbing, and this one was climbing. She had told Nelson Wednesday morning that they needed the doctor, and the look on his face when he understood what she was saying was the face of a man who had already lost someone, and for whom any threat to the people left behind was a fresh exposure of a wound that had never properly closed. He had ridden to town himself rather than sending Arlo, which told her everything about his state of mind, and she had sat with Thomas through the day, keeping him cool with wet cloths, coaxing water into him, talking to him in the low, steady way she had learned from watching the way horses are talked to when they are frightened, which is the same way people need to be talked to when they are very sick and a little scared. Caleb had stayed near the doorway all day, not in the room, because he was 14 and felt he needed to be useful rather than present, but he had fetched water and cloth without being asked, and he had not spoken much, but he had been there with that solid, quiet steadiness that was so specifically his father's that it made her heart ache with something too complicated to have a name. Dr. Farwell arrived in the late afternoon, a compact, gray-haired man who smelled of carbolic, and had the calm authority of someone who had been doctoring in the territory for 20 years and had seen most things there were to see. He examined Thomas and said it was a chest infection, real and serious but addressable, and he gave her specific instructions for the dosing and care, and he looked at her and said, "You've been doing everything right." She had been holding her breath for hours and let it out slowly when he said that. Nelson had come upstairs when the doctor left and stood in the doorway of Thomas's room and looked at his son sleeping in the lamplit quiet. She had been sitting at the bedside and she started to get up to give him the chair, and he had said, "Stay," and pulled up a second chair from the corner and sat beside her. They had sat together beside Thomas's bed for 3 hours that evening, taking turns changing the cloths, monitoring his breathing, and talking in very low voices about things that had nothing to do with the fear in the room. He had told her about Margaret's death, which had been a fever too, swift and absolute, a woman of 31 who had been strong and full of life and who had gone in 11 days, and the way he told it was careful and sparse in the way of a man who has gone over this story enough times in his own mind that its edges are all worn smooth. He said, "I didn't know what to do with the boys after. I didn't know how to do any of it." She said, "You did it anyway." He said badly, she said. You kept them, you kept going, that is not nothing. He said, you don't have to make it better than it was. She said, I'm telling you what I see. She paused. They are good boys, Nelson. They are good in the specific ways that come from being raised by someone who cared even when the caring was imperfect. He was quiet. Then he said, she would have liked you. This landed differently than she expected. She said, you don't have to say that. He said, I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's true. She liked people who didn't perform. He looked at his son's sleeping face. She always said the best kind of person was someone who did the real thing instead of the pretty version of the thing. Della said, she sounds like someone I would have liked too. He looked at her then, in the lamplight, with Thomas's quiet breathing between them, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before and one she would not forget. It was the expression of a man who has been in the dark for a very long time and has seen, suddenly and without warning, a light he had not been sure he believed in anymore. Thomas recovered. Over the following week he improved steadily, and by the end of the week he was sitting up in bed demanding to hear the rest of David Copperfield, and complaining that broth was not food, which was, the doctor said, the best possible sign. After Thomas was fully recovered, Nelson had come to the kitchen one morning while she was making breakfast and had stood at the counter for a moment in a way that indicated he had come to say something and was organizing himself to say it. She kept working, cutting the salt pork for the pan, because she had learned that Nelson said things better when she was not looking directly at him. He said, "This isn't what you were promised." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I wrote that letter in a practical way, a business arrangement, work, wages, legal standing, that's what I offered." She said, "Yes," he said, "and you've done all of that and more than that, more than what was asked." She said, "That's who I am, I don't know how to do things halfway." He said, "I know that now." A pause. "I want to change the terms." Her hand stilled over the cutting board. She waited. He said, "I want this to be a real marriage. If that's something you want. I'm not asking out of obligation or convenience anymore. I'm asking because," he stopped. He said, "You are the most remarkable person I have ever watched work. You walked into a house full of locked doors and broken things and you didn't try to fix them with a hammer. You waited. You paid attention. You made space for things to grow back." Another pause. "And I don't want to keep pretending that I don't feel what I feel, because it's a waste of whatever time we have, and I've already wasted enough time being afraid." She turned around. He was looking at her with that direct, careful steadiness that she had come to understand was the most honest version of him. No performance, no barrier, just Nelson Boone standing in his own kitchen, saying the real thing instead of the pretty version of the thing. She said, "I have loved you since October." He said, "What happened in October?" She said, "You cleaned and re-seasoned the skillet I ruined. You didn't make a thing of it. You just fixed it and put it back and left cornmeal on the table." He stared at her. He said, "That's what did it," she said. "You showed me who you were. That's always what does it." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the careful, deliberate intensity of a man who has thought about doing this for a long time. And the salt pork burned, and neither of them noticed. And when they finally did notice, the smoke alarm of the birds going up outside was the only sound, and she had started to laugh and so had he, and she had looked at his face laughing in her kitchen and thought, "This is the thing that cannot be taken back," and she was glad. The spring of 1884 changed the shape of everything. The marriage that had been quiet and careful and formal became something else. It did not change overnight, because neither of them were people who did things overnight. They were both careful in their hearts, both scarred in specific and individual ways, and their love, if it could be said to have a pace, was the pace of 2 people who had decided that the real thing was worth going slowly for, worth building correctly, worth not rushing toward the way you rush toward something you are afraid might disappear. But it grew. It grew in the evenings on the porch when the day was done, and they sat together, watching the stars come out over the red land. It grew in the mornings when he came in from the early barn work, and she had coffee ready, and he put his hand on her shoulder for a moment before sitting down, a touch so small and ordinary that anyone watching might have missed it. It grew in the laughter, which was the most remarkable thing. Nelson Boone laughed. Not frequently, not easily, but genuinely and completely when it happened, the kind of laugh that comes from deep in the chest and surprises the person doing it. Thomas became the engine of this phenomenon. He was 12 by spring, and had come back from his illness with a vitality that had the quality of someone who has been frightened and has emerged determined to be more fully alive. He had a gift for absurdity that seemed to delight him as much as it delighted everyone around him, and the table at dinner in the Boone household had become a place where things happened, where stories were told, and arguments were made and opinions were held and challenged, and laughter was not a rare and precious exception, but a regular and expected feature of the evening. Caleb had, over the course of these months, made his own quieter version of a return. He was 15 in the spring, and had the intensity of a boy on the edge of becoming something, full of ideas and questions, and a kind of focused energy that needed direction. He had started asking Della questions about books, prompted by the David Copperfield evenings, and she had begun lending him things from her small collection, and they had fallen into a habit of talking about what he read, which Nelson observed from across the room with the expression of a man who is watching something extraordinary happen and cannot quite believe his luck. One evening in April, Caleb had said to Della without prelude, "I want to go to school, a real school, not just what we have here." There was a secondary school in Santa Fe, run by the Territory Educational Authority, that was a possible destination for a boy of Caleb's ability. Della had been thinking about it for weeks but had not raised it because it was not her place to redirect Nelson's plans for his son. Nelson had said, "What kind of school?" Caleb had told him. He had apparently been researching it with a focus that he had kept private, which impressed Della, and also made her a little bit proud in the specific way that teachers feel pride at a student's initiative. The conversation that followed, that evening and over the following weeks, was one of the most important the Boone household had. It was a conversation about futures, about what Caleb wanted to become, about what was possible, about the complicated feelings of a father whose firstborn son was beginning to grow away from him in the necessary and healthy way that sons do. It was also a conversation about what the ranch meant and whether it was a destination or a starting point. Nelson had been, Della knew, unconsciously assuming that his boys would take over the ranch, the way that his father had assumed about him. But Nelson's father had been wrong, or right, depending on how you looked at it, and Nelson had ended up doing what he wanted with the land his father left him, which was to work it on his own terms. The question was whether he could afford his son the same freedom. He could, and he did. It cost him something, she could see that, but he said yes, and the pride in Caleb's face when his father said it was something she held in her memory like a pressed flower, kept between the pages of an important story. Harriet Moore became Della's genuine friend that spring. They were different enough in age and experience that the friendship had surprised them both. But Harriet was a woman who had been in the territory long enough to have a purely functional assessment of who was useful and who was not, and she had decided that Della was extremely useful and also genuinely good company, which she said was a rare combination in any climate. They had established a habit of coffee at the dry goods store on the days Della came to town, and these conversations were among the things Della looked forward to most, because Harriet knew the whole of Cassidy Creek and its history, and spoke about it with a dry, frank affection that was deeply satisfying to Della's own natural need to understand the places she was in. It was Harriet who told her in April that Agnes Whitmore had been seen crying in the church on a Sunday morning, alone, before the service, and that the minister's wife had found her and spoken with her, and that Agnes had apparently said some things about Margaret and about Nelson, and about the particular grief of watching a person you had loved in secret for a long time find their happiness with someone else. Della had sat with this information for a moment. She said she loved him. Harriet said, "I expect she's always loved him." She married Robert Whitmore at 19 because that was what was available and because Nelson was already with Margaret, and I think she built her life around being necessary to Margaret so she could stay close to him, and when Margaret died she thought something would change and then you arrived. Della said, "That is very sad." Harriet said, "Yes, it is. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it explains it." Della thought about this for a long time, and then she did something that surprised even herself. She wrote Agnes Whitmore a letter. Not a confrontational letter, not one that made claims or issued warnings. A letter that said simply that she was sorry for whatever pain Agnes was carrying, and that she had never wanted to be anyone's adversary, and that she understood the grief of being close to a loss without having the acknowledged right to grieve it. She said that Margaret clearly had a friend in Agnes who had loved her truly, and that she hoped in time they could be, if not friends, at least people who were kind to each other in a small town they both called home. Agnes Whitmore did not respond for 3 weeks. Then she had come into the dry goods store on a Thursday when Della was there, and she had said, stiffly and without warmth but with a visible and clearly effortful sincerity, "I received your letter. I think you are a better person than I have given you credit for being." Della had said, "I think we both love people in this town and I think that is a place to start." It was not a friendship. It was perhaps the beginning of a truce. But it was something, and in the small economy of a frontier town, something was often everything. The summer of 1884 was long and golden and full. The ranch had a good season, the cattle bringing better prices than Nelson had expected, and there was a stretch of weeks in July and August where the work was hard and the evenings were cool, and the household ran with the particular warm efficiency of a group of people who have found their rhythm together. Arlo Sims, who had watched all of this unfold from the vantage point of a man who had worked this land through its worst years and was quietly grateful for its better ones, said to Nelson one morning in the barn, without looking up from what he was doing, "You're different this year." Nelson said, "How do you mean?" Arlo said, "The way you walk mostly. You stopped walking like a man waiting for something to fall on him." Nelson had apparently not had an answer to this, which Arlo later told Della with the satisfaction of a man who considers having the last word in a conversation with Nelson Boone a significant achievement. In August, something happened that Della had not been anticipating, and which arrived with the particular stealth of things that have been made possible by happiness. She was going to have a baby. She had been sure for 2 weeks before she told Nelson, turning it over in her mind, examining it from every angle, feeling the enormous complicated weight of it, and also, beneath the complication, an unambiguous joy that she had not been prepared for. She had not thought, when she clipped an advertisement out of a newspaper in a boarding house in Albuquerque, that she would be standing in a kitchen on an 800-acre ranch in New Mexico, a year later carrying the child of a man she loved with a depth and specificity that still sometimes caught her off guard. She told him on a Saturday evening after the boys were in bed, on the porch, in the way they had of sitting together at the end of the day when the world was quiet. She said, "I need to tell you something." He had looked at her, and she thought he might have suspected, because he had been watching her with a slightly different quality of attention for the past week. She said, "We are going to have a child." The expression on his face went through several things in quick succession: shock, and then a rapid, thorough joy, and then something that she recognized as the ghost of fear, the old fear, the one that had nothing to do with this child and everything to do with the one he had lost before, the fear of loving something so much and having the world take it. She reached out and took his hand. She said, "I know what you're afraid of." He said, "I know you do." She said, "I am not going anywhere." He said, "You don't know that." She said, "I know I am not going anywhere on purpose, and the rest is in God's hands, and I think," she squeezed his hand, "that you have been afraid of that long enough." He held her hand in both of his and looked at the dark land and the stars and the lights from the house behind them. He said, "I am more happy right now than I have been in a very long time." She said, "Good, hold on to that." He did. The telling of the boys was a matter of some careful planning. Thomas, when told at breakfast on a Sunday, had gone very still for a moment and then said, with the absolute seriousness of a boy of 12, "Does this mean I am not going to be the youngest anymore?" And when Della said that was correct, he had said, "Finally," with a vehemence that made Nelson choke on his coffee and Della laugh, until tears ran down her face, and Caleb looked between his brother and his father with the expression of a boy trying very hard to maintain some dignity while his household lost its mind around him, which he eventually gave up on and laughed too. Caleb, in the private conversation she had with him later, had said, "Are you happy? Really, truly happy?" And she had understood that this was the question he had been holding for a long time, the question underneath all the others, and she had said, "Yes, Caleb, really, truly." He had nodded once, with a gravity that was so like his father she had to look away for a moment, and then he had said, "Good," and that was all, and it was enough. Caleb left for the secondary school in Santa Fe in September of 1884, and his departure was the emotional complexity of the year, the thing that showed them all something about themselves. Nelson had driven him to the stage in Cassidy Creek, and Della had come, and Thomas had come, and when the stage was loaded and the moment came, Nelson had put his hand on his son's shoulder and they had looked at each other, and Caleb had said, "I'll write," and Nelson had said, "I know you will." And then Caleb had hugged his father, a real and total hug, the kind that 14-year-olds who have been storing up the impulse for a long time produce when they finally stop managing themselves. And Nelson had held him with both arms, and his eyes had been very bright when they separated. Caleb had hugged Della too and said, "Thank you for everything," in a voice that was attempting to be composed and not entirely succeeding. She had said, "You are going to be extraordinary. Write me when you need a book recommended." He had gotten on the stage grinning. The drive back to the ranch had been quiet in the good way. Thomas had fallen asleep against Della's shoulder. Nelson had driven with one hand on the reins and one hand around her, and the country had been golden and wide and entirely itself. And she had thought of herself a year ago on this same road, looking out at the same land and thinking, "Well, here you are at the far edge of everything." And she had been right about that, and wrong about what it meant. She was not at the edge, she was at the center. This was the center. By December of 1884, she was visibly, unmistakably carrying their child, and the changes in the house were visible in everything. In the way Nelson had spent a week building an addition to the upstairs room, in the cradle he had produced from the barn which had been his own, and then Caleb's and then Thomas's, cleaned and repaired with the meticulous care he gave to things he loved. In the way Thomas had taken to talking to her stomach with the complete absence of self-consciousness that 11 going on 12-year-olds have when they have decided that something is important and social convention has not yet told them to pretend otherwise. Nelson had said to her one evening in December, "Last year at this time we had been married 3 months and I didn't know what to make of you," she said. "And now," he said, "now I cannot imagine the shape of a day that doesn't have you in it," she said. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He said, "I thought the skillet was the romantic thing." She said, "That was the romantic thing that started everything. This is the romantic thing that keeps it going." He kissed her temple and she leaned against him, and the fire was warm and the house was alive around them, with Thomas somewhere upstairs narrating some elaborate imaginary adventure to himself, and the wind was outside where it belonged, and there was nothing dark in the house at all. The baby arrived on a March morning in 1885. It was a boy. They named him James because it was Nelson's father's name, and also because it was strong and simple, and fit the weight of a child born into a family that had come through a great deal to get to him. The labor had been long, and Della had been attended by the doctor and by Harriet Moore, who had arrived without being asked and had been absolutely indispensable, and Nelson had stayed as close as he was permitted, and had been, by all accounts, terrible at waiting, which Thomas later described in detail with a vividness that suggested he had been watching from a strategic vantage point. When Harriet had brought James to him for the first time, Nelson had held his son with the careful, total attention of a man who understands exactly what he is holding, and he had looked up at Della, and his face was everything she had ever needed from him, open and unguarded and full of the kind of love that has stopped being afraid of itself. She said, "There he is." He said, "There he is." A pause. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For burning that cornbread." She laughed, which made James startle and then settle, and Thomas, who had not been as far away as he was supposed to be, immediately started narrating the event to someone or something in the hallway in a low, excited commentary that made Harriet Moore put her face in her hands in an attempt to compose herself. Caleb was home for the summer by the time James was 3 months old, and the first morning he was home, he came downstairs to find his little brother being held by his father in the kitchen, with Della making breakfast and Thomas already talking, and he stood in the doorway for a moment taking it in before he came in and took James from Nelson's arms and looked at him with the serious, wondering look of a 15-year-old encountering something that recalibrates his understanding of the world. He said to Della, "He looks like Dad," she said. "He has your mother's ears, I think." Caleb had looked at her, startled. He said, "You can see that?" She said, "I have looked at the photograph of her in the parlor many times." Caleb stood with James for a while, the baby watching him with the alert, unfocused attention of infants, and then Caleb said, "She would have liked him." Della said, "I think so too." They ate breakfast with James in his cradle near the table and Thomas, providing unasked-for commentary on everything, and Caleb asking questions about the ranch and Nelson looking around his table, with an expression that had settled into something she had not seen on him before, something quiet and deep and sure. The expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. After breakfast, while the boys were outside, Nelson had come to where she was washing the dishes and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on her hair, in the way he had taken to doing, which she had decided was her favorite thing, the simple, claiming warmth of it, the completeness. He said, "I want to say something." She said, "All right." He said, "Last Christmas when Thomas laughed at the burned cornbread." I had not heard that sound in so long that I had almost forgotten what it did to me. When they were small, Margaret used to burn things because she talked too much, and they would laugh every time, like it was the funniest thing in the world, and when she was gone, the laughing stopped, and I didn't know until that moment in the kitchen when you burned it on purpose that I had been holding the weight of that silence the whole time, every day, and not knowing it was the weight I was carrying. She was very still in his arms. He said, "You gave that back to them, and then you gave it back to me. And I don't know how to put a word on what that is worth." She said, "You don't have to put a word on it." He said, I want to say it properly." She turned around in his arms and looked at him. He said, "I love you. Not because of what you do, though what you do is remarkable. Not because you're here, though I'm grateful every day that you're here. I love you because of the specific person you are, Della, the way you see things and the way you fix things without making people feel broken, and the way you're fair even when fairness costs you, and the way you laugh, and the way you are always completely yourself." She felt the warmth of it move through her entirely, not the startled, tentative warmth of something new, but the deep, established warmth of something true, the warmth of a fire that has been building long enough to have real heat in it. She said, "I love you, Nelson Boone. I love you for the skillet and for the salt pork, and for standing on that stage platform in Cassidy Creek and defending me before you had any reason to care that much. I love you for Caleb and Thomas, because being a man who raised those boys so well is one of the most telling things I know about you. I love you for being afraid and doing things anyway. I love you for being exactly who you are." He kissed her, and James made a sound from his cradle, and outside the window Thomas was telling the chickens some elaborate story, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called into the morning, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular clean scent of the high desert in spring. It was 1885, and the ranch was alive, and the house was full of sound, and the woman who had come to this place from the far edge of her own life had found herself, without quite intending to, at the exact center of everything that mattered. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because life on a working ranch in the New Mexico territory never is, and difficulty was simply the texture of a life lived honestly in hard country. There were years when the cattle prices fell, and the margin was thin. There was a drought in 1887 that turned the land to dust for 7 months and required every calculation and conservation effort Della and Nelson could manage together. There was the year Arlo Sim's health began to fail, and the long process of helping an old man who had given 12 years of his life to this operation find his way to a dignified rest, which ended with Arlo spending his last 2 years in the small room off the kitchen that they cleared for him, cared for by the household with the matter-of-fact warmth that had become the family's way. There was the terrible week in 1888 when a letter came from Caleb in Santa Fe saying that he had met a girl, a daughter of a Mexican land-grant family named Rosa Gutierrez, and that her family did not approve of him, and that he did not know what to do. Della had written back a letter of 4 pages, dense with practical advice, and also with the clear and stated position that love worth having is worth fighting for through the right means, and that the right means were patience and respect, and the slow, steady demonstration of who you were, not argument or pressure. Nelson had written a single page that said, among other things, that Rosa Gutierrez's family were right to be protective of her, and that earning their respect would be worth more than any shortcut, and that if Caleb was serious, he should be willing to do the slow work. Caleb had married Rosa Gutierrez in 1890, in a ceremony in Santa Fe that was attended by both families, and was remarkable for the warmth between people who had had to work to get there, which was the best possible kind of warmth. Rosa was sharp and funny, and had a direct quality that reminded Della of herself enough to be gratifying, and she had looked at Nelson Boone at the reception and said, "Your son is the best man I have ever met, and I understand he had good examples," which had made Nelson stand slightly straighter in the way that compliments he could not deflect always affected him. Thomas had remained at the ranch. He had grown into a young man of 19 in 1890, who was physically his father's echo and temperamentally his own entire thing, still funny, still generating commentary on the world around him at a steady pace, but with a deepening steadiness underneath it, a real competence with the land and the animals that made the work of running the ranch a genuine partnership between him and Nelson. James was 5 in 1890 and was, in everyone's opinion including her own, something of a force of nature. He was dark-eyed and quick-moving, and had learned to ride before he had fully stopped needing help to get on the horse, and he had the specific and total confidence of a child who has never doubted for a single day that he was loved, which was the most beautiful thing Della had ever produced. In the spring of 1891, Della discovered she was expecting again, which had surprised everyone including her, James being 6 and the family feeling, she had thought, complete. But there it was, and when she told Nelson he had laughed the deep, unguarded laugh that she still considered one of the most precious sounds she had access to, and he had said, "Well, here we go again." It was a girl this time, born in November of 1891, and they named her Clara after Nelson's mother, and she arrived into a household that was already too full, and immediately became the center of it in the way that youngest children in large, loving families do. James was fascinated by her with a possessive intensity that required management. Thomas was delighted by her in the way that young men of 20 are delighted by babies when they are not personally responsible for them. Nelson held her in the way he had held James, with the careful, total attention of a man who knows what he has, and Della watched him hold his daughter and felt the full settled weight of her life, the specific gravity of a life that has arrived where it was going. Caleb came for Christmas of 1891 with Rosa and their own son, a 1-year-old named Marco who had the combined genetic force of 2 strong families in his small body, and made his presence felt accordingly. The house at Christmas that year had the quality of abundance, physical and otherwise, full of people in every room, full of food and noise, and the particular laughter of a family that has its full number. On Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep and the adults were sitting around the fire with their coffee, Caleb had said, "Do you remember the burned cornbread?" He said it to Della with a smile that was both his father's and entirely his own. She said vividly, he said, "I didn't understand then what you were doing. I just knew it was funny. I think I understood later, maybe when I was 16 or 17, I thought about it and I understood." He looked at his father. "That was the day things started to come back," Thomas said. "I always knew she did it on purpose." Nelson said, "Did you?" Thomas said. "There was nothing accidental about that woman in any context ever." "I figured that out about 2 weeks in." Della said. "You were 11." Thomas said. "I was perceptive." Rosa laughed, a clear, warm sound, and Marco stirred in the cradle near the fire, and Clara was upstairs in her room with James standing guard in the doorway in the way that 6-year-old brothers do when they have decided a sibling is their responsibility. Nelson looked at Della across the room with the look she knew best, the one she had first identified on the night of the cornbread, and had been receiving ever since in 100 variations, each one the same essential thing, which was the look of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, looking at the person who brought him there. She looked back at him. Caleb caught this exchange and looked away with the private smile of a young man who knows a love story when he sees one, even in retrospect, even after growing up inside it. Outside, the New Mexico territory held its winter dark, the stars dense and extravagant over the flat red land, the coyotes singing somewhere to the south, the horses quiet in the barn. The fence line held. The land was still. The fire was warm, and in the kitchen, 2 feet from where a pan of cornbread had once burned with deliberate and necessary intention, the life that had been built from that one small, careful act of love went on, and was good. The next morning, on Christmas Day, Della rose early in the way she always did, the habit of the ranch in her bones by now, and she came down to the kitchen before anyone else was awake and built the fire in the stove and put the coffee on. She stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn light and looked at the land she had come to love, the particular color of it at this hour, the quiet enormity of it, and she thought about the woman she had been when she arrived here, careful and broke and proud and determined, and the woman she was now, who was all of those things still but was also something more, something that had been made possible by a man who reseasoned a skillet and never made a thing of it. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the familiar weight of them, unhurried. He came into the kitchen and put his hand on the back of her neck under her hair, a simple, warm pressure that said everything it always said. He said, "Merry Christmas." She said, "Merry Christmas, Nelson." He poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window, and they watched the sky begin to lighten over the red country, and the children slept above them, and the land stretched out in every direction under a sky that had always been enormous, and there was nothing between them and everything they had made that needed to be said. Upstairs, James began to stir, talking to himself in the way he always woke up, narrating his own existence from the first moment of consciousness, which Nelson said was entirely Thomas's fault and Della said was entirely his own fault, and they were both probably right. Clara made the small sound that preceded her real waking, the one that James had already learned to identify from his self-appointed post, and a moment later they heard the small, careful footsteps of a 6-year-old going to his sister, and then his voice, clear and serious and full of the unself-conscious tenderness of a child who has never had to learn that love is allowed. He said, "Good morning, Clara. It's Christmas. Everything is going to be wonderful today." Nelson put his arm around Della's shoulder. She leaned into him. Below the wide New Mexico sky, in the kitchen that had smelled like smoke and possibility on an autumn morning 2 years after the worst thing had happened. The family that had been built from equal parts necessity and courage, and one deliberately burned pan of cornbread held its Christmas morning, whole and full and entirely, irreversibly, joyfully itself.